Hello guys and welcome back. So now we're going to look at a node in Houdini that ships by default with it. That's called the debris source. I'm going to hit tab, create a debris source node, and it requires the geometry, the impact geometry deforming. So we're going to create that, and I'm going to download transform pieces. And this is the geometry that we're going to use to keep this. This is a lot of data to work with for this node, and to keep it simple, I'm going to isolate certain parts, primarily this section, because maybe this section here. I can just select the pieces I want and hit tab, blast. Okay. And then I'm going to use that with the debris source because this is going to be much faster to work with. And it has very little option, which is great. It can read the geometry and generate points on the edges of the pieces, and as soon as they start separating, it will create those points and give them a color based on their velocity. And the search radius is basically how far it looks between the cracks, how big the cracks are. A value of 0.1 is generally enough for this scale. So actually for the scale I'm going to scale it down. I want to work with everything scaled down at 0.1. And let me delete these two objects if I can. I'm going to select them. Just hit blast afterward. Okay, so let's see, and then the number of the search rate, the search point is how much points it's gonna scatter points on the geometry, and then based on this region, based on this value, it will consider how much it's gonna look for it to do its calculation. Let me close these. So what I like to do, it has two options. It's either going to emit on the edges or on the surfaces. I'd like to create two different sources, one with the one for the edges and one for the surface itself. So let's call this edges. I'm going to set the value to something really high so we have enough points to work with. And remember, this is a sim, so it needs we need to cast this out to be able to visualize it. You see there is a reset sim here, and let's hit play, and we should see objects moving. Cool, so this is working with the packed primitive, so that's why the result is not correct. So I'm going to unpack it here. Actually, the impact should work. So impact should work here. If the transfer doesn't work, we probably need to make sure we transfer the name. Yeah, so when we impact the data, we just have to make sure that the name is getting transferred. So let's go back. And this node requires the actual geometry, not the packed primitives. Yeah, so it's working. I'm not so sure why it has these flat faces. Oh, I know why. That's because we killed the pieces, so it needs the full geometry, because these parts are looking, they don't have any neighbors to check with, because it analyzes the inside faces versus the outside, and these guys are left without any of that. So I'm going to turn this, I'm going to remove the blast and cache this. I'm going to show you guys the result. This is how the edges looks like once we have all the pieces integrated, and as you can see, it's only emitting from the edges. And it's gonna analyze, for example, see this part here, It's going to analyze when an object gets separated and emits from that, and it also initializes a color that starts white and then decays over time. So it doesn't just emit constantly, it fades off over time, and that's very, very important because we don't want the emission to be continuous. And the second source that I'm going to create is faces. And for this guy, I'm going to set the point to 20,000 on the surfaces. I'm going to cache it to disk. And this is the result. And you can see here it's doing a much better job than just the velocity. We can also use the color to, let's say, instead of having it fade slowly, we can change that and remove anything that is, let's say, of this color, for example, or gray, and this way it's much sharper in the emission. Actually, let's do that. Let's do that using a blast node. And cd.x 0.5, for example, we want to delete points, and now it's much sharper. The termination is much sharper. Another thing I like to do is I like to add some velocity constraints, and I want to delete objects that are not moving at all. So I copied the velocity node that we created, and I'm gonna set it to let's expose this. So here you can see everything is black, and then as soon as it starts moving, it gets colored with white. I don't want the range to be aggressive. I want to keep anything that is moving, even the slightest bit, but I want to kill anything that is static, because in the first few frames there is few things that are static, so I want to remove those. And this is going to improve the source a lot more. We can also multiply it by the original color, so we don't lose that decay if we want to use that to do any emission or anything like that. Any controls. Let's multiply that with this, and now we have that fade off. And let's add the blast. And this is our second interesting source. So we're going to use this with the same particle sim. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to copy this. I'm going to copy all this. Actually, I'm going to copy more than that. I'm going to copy these guys as well. And it looks like I didn't copy the sim itself. Okay. Cool, so I'm gonna let this run for 100 frames, and let's change the settings a bit so it's more interesting. I'm gonna show the geometry as well. And I'm only emitting from the surface at the moment, which is fine. There's a lot of options. I don't have any magic guide for what to emit from and what to create source from. As long as you get interesting visual and you find a way to use any of the methods, that's totally fine. I generally explore a variety of techniques to get the result I want, and most of the time mixing all kinds of sources is the thing that does the trick. You have to get a lot of interesting emission, a lot of interesting behaviors, and all these layers. So we've created 2 so far. I'm probably going to create another one from the actual debris, the actual edges, and maybe give those a different size or give them a different motion so you get more layering. And then we're going to create a smoke field and use that to eject particles as well. So we're going to mix all kinds of methods. It's not just one method that creates the final result. It's a mixture of a lot of elements together. And you can see this guy will emit from the falling objects, which is what we want. Yeah. It's probably still like some more, and we can do things by hand if we wanted to. Cool. So in the next video we're going to start looking at creating the debris trails, the smoke source for to create the trails, the smoke trails from the object. So we'll start doing that in the next video, and also look at this for 100 frames. Thank you guys for watching, and see you in a bit.